Hey, traveler. Put on your headphones and let the day fade. Close your eyes, breathe slow, and let history drift you into dreams.
You know, revenge is a funny thing. Not funny as in ha-ha, more like strange, slippery, and so very human. People like to pretend it's a dark, twisted urge that only bad folks give into. But let's be honest. Haven't you, at some quiet moment, thought about it? Not the big, dramatic movie kind, just a tiny wish for someone to get exactly what they deserve. A little poetic justice. Now imagine that feeling stretched until it's sharp enough to cut. And then imagine someone holding on to it for years, feeding it carefully, like keeping a fire smoldering in the corner of a dark room. That's where our story begins, with a woman who did exactly that, in a way so methodical and so creative that she ended up in history books. And the strangest part, she didn't start as a warrior or a killer or even someone who looked particularly dangerous. She started as a queen. Her name was Olga, Olga of Kiev. But before she was of Kiev, before she was queen, she was just a young woman from the north, clever and composed, with a face people noticed not because she was the most beautiful in the room, but because she had that rare sort of calm that made you think she knew something you didn't. We don't know a lot about her early life. Back then, history didn't care much for a young woman's childhood unless she did something scandalous. But from the little scraps we do know, she was smart, reserved, and had a way of watching people that made her seem older than her years. She married a man named Igor. Now, Igor wasn't some fairy tale prince with shining armor. He was a ruler, the Grand Prince of the Kievan Rus, which meant he was constantly juggling power, alliances, and the endless headaches of ruling over lands that stretched across forests, rivers, and steppe. But Igor was steady, and he treated Olga as more than just a decorative queen. The two were partners. Not exactly a love story you'd find in a romantic ballad, but they understood each other. He trusted her counsel. She gave it quietly, without making him feel small. Together, they ran a realm that was powerful, wealthy, and ambitious. And then came the Drevlians. Now, the Drevlians weren't some ragtag band of rebels. They were a neighboring tribe, technically allies, though allies in those days meant we won't kill each other unless it's profitable. They paid tribute to Kiev in return for peace. Simple enough arrangement. Until greed and opportunity whispered in their ears. It happened in the year 945. Igor had gone to collect tribute from the Drevlians. The first payment they gave was fair, but Igor, for reasons that have been debated for centuries, decided to go back and demand more. Maybe the treasury was low, maybe someone convinced him he could squeeze them. Maybe he just thought he could. Whatever his reasons, it turned out to be the worst decision of his life. The Drevlians didn't just refuse, they killed him. And they didn't do it quickly or cleanly. They tied him to two bent-down birch trees, one leg to each trunk, and then let the trees snap back. You don't need me to paint the rest of that picture for you. That's how Olga's husband died. When word reached Kiev, Olga didn't weep in public. She didn't tear her hair or wail in the streets. No, she listened. She stood still, listening to the messenger tell her every detail. People watching probably thought she was made of stone. Inside, though, well, that's the thing about calm people. You can never quite tell what storms are building in there. The Drevlians must have thought she would be easy to handle. She was a widow now, and widows in power were vulnerable. So they sent messengers to Kiev with a proposal. She should marry their prince, Mal. That way they could unite their peoples, which really meant they could swallow Kiev without a fight. Olga sent back word that she would consider it, and invited their delegation to come in person. When they arrived, she welcomed them warmly. She had baths prepared for them in the traditional way in a large wooden bathhouse. The men stepped inside, no doubt congratulating themselves on how clever they were. Olga had the doors barred from the outside. Then she ordered the bathhouse set on fire. Not a single man came out alive. That could have been enough. That alone would have sent a clear message. But Olga was just getting started. She sent word to the Drevlians that she'd accepted their proposal and asked them to send more important men to escort her. They obliged, probably thinking the first group had just stayed behind for negotiations. When these new men arrived, she had them carried in boats to the center of Kiev under the pretense of honoring them. The people lifted them up in their boats, dropped them into a great pit, and buried them alive. If you're keeping count, that's 2 entire delegations gone. But still she wasn't satisfied. Revenge for her wasn't just about punishing, it was about dismantling. So she went to the Drevlians' capital under the guise of making peace. They held a great feast in her honor. The mead flowed, the food was rich, and when the Drevlians were well and truly drunk, her soldiers cut them down by the hundreds. Some say 5,000 died that night. Still she wasn't done. She laid siege to their city, and here's where her creativity reached its peak. Instead of battering the gates or starving them out, she offered them a deal. If they paid tribute, she would spare them. But instead of gold or grain, she asked for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. It must have seemed absurdly easy. They brought the birds. Olga's men tied small pieces of sulfur-bound cloth to the birds' legs and set them alight. When the birds were released, they flew straight back to their nests in the city, in lofts, under eaves, tucked into roofs. One by one, fires bloomed across the city. The people fled into the waiting arms of her army. By the time she was finished, the Drevlians were no more. Now, sitting here telling you this, I can almost see her, standing among the smoking ruins, her expression unreadable. Was she satisfied? Relieved? Empty? History doesn't say, but I think about that moment a lot, because here's the thing. Revenge can give you back power, but it can't give you back what you've lost. Olga went on to rule Kiev for years, strengthening it, defending it, even becoming a saint in the Orthodox Church. Imagine that. A saint. It makes you wonder if the people who gave her that title ever really thought about the bathhouse, the pit, the feast, the burning birds. Or maybe they did, and they admired her all the more for it. And you know, her story makes me think of another, not about a queen, but about a man who also faced humiliation and came back sharper, deadlier, and entirely on his own terms. He lived in a different world, warmer seas, different gods, different rules. But the core of it? The core was the same. Someone wronged him, thought they could get away with it, and learned just how expensive that mistake could be. It was the Mediterranean centuries before Olga's time. The sun there was a thing that could bleach bone and burn skin in a single afternoon. And somewhere along those glittering coasts, a young man, not yet the ruler history would remember him as, was taken by pirates. They thought they'd caught just another rich Roman they could ransom. But what they didn't realize was that they'd just invited Julius Caesar into their lives. And Caesar was not the kind of man you held prisoner without consequences. But that, well, that's a story for next time.
You remember, don't you, how we left Olga? The quiet in that moment after her revenge was almost heavier than the act itself. I told you she didn't look back. Some people can, some people can't. And there's something about revenge. Once you've carried it out, the world shifts. You start seeing connections in strange places. And speaking of strange connections, let me tell you about someone from a very different world, a very different time, but with that same quiet fire inside. This one isn't set in the frost of the Slavic north. We're heading south, far south, to the warm air of the Mediterranean. The sun there isn't shy. It spills gold over everything. The whitewashed walls, the restless blue sea, the faces of fishermen mending their nets. If you close your eyes, you can smell it. Salt, olives, and that faint sharpness of tar from the ship's hulls. It's the year 75 BC. Rome isn't yet an empire, but it's trying very hard to act like one. The seas, though, they aren't Roman. Not entirely. They belong to pirates. And these aren't the storybook kind with parrots and rum. These are lean, dangerous men from Cilicia, quick to laugh and quicker to draw steel, living off ransom and plunder. Somewhere along the coast of Asia Minor, a young Roman noble is sailing. He's just 25, but he already carries himself like someone born to be obeyed. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar wasn't supposed to be there, not like this. He was on his way to study rhetoric and roads, to sharpen his words, not his sword. But fate has a habit of stepping in with its own lesson plans. One morning, under that perfect blue sky, sails appeared on the horizon. Not Roman sails. These were darker, lower, faster. The rower's arms rose and fell like the legs of a spider. Before Caesar's crew could react, the ships were alongside. Grappling hooks bit into wood, pirates clambered aboard, and in minutes, the young noble was surrounded. The pirates weren't sure who they had caught, not yet, but they could tell from the clothes, the bearing, the lack of fear in his eyes. This wasn't some merchant. This was someone worth money. They decided on a ransom, 20 talents of silver, a fortune. And here's where the first twist comes. Caesar, instead of begging or protesting, laughed in their faces. 20 talents, he said, as if they'd insulted him. Do you have any idea who I am? Make it 50. 50 talents, more than double. The pirates glanced at one another. This man was unusual. Arrogant, yes, but also oddly entertaining. So they took him to their island hideout to wait for the ransom. I like to imagine that first evening there, the campfires flickering, the smell of roasting fish, the creak of ropes in the night wind. Caesar sits among them, not bound like a prisoner, but lounging as if he is an honored guest. He jokes with them, he writes poetry, he even orders them to be quiet when he's trying to sleep. And they obey, half in disbelief, half in respect. But here's the thing, under all that charm, Caesar is watching, measuring every face, every boat, every weak point in their defenses. Sometimes at night, when the fire burns low, he tells them, "You know, when my ransom is paid, I'm going to come back and crucify every last one of you." And the pirates roar with laughter. Oh, they think he's joking. Some men joke about revenge because it makes them feel braver. But Caesar is making a promise. The days stretch into weeks. Messengers are sent to fetch the silver from his friends and family. The pirates grow used to him, maybe too used to him. They play dice together. They spar with wooden swords. Some even start calling him Little King. But Caesar never forgets where he is. Every morning, as the sun spills over the sea, he walks the shore, pretending to admire the view, and quietly counts the ships. He notes how many men go out fishing, how many stay to guard the camp, which of them is quick to anger and which is lazy. He even learns their songs, storing away details in the same part of his mind where he's keeping the plan. One evening, as the ransom is nearly ready, the wind shifts. The air smells heavier, like rain. Caesar sits by the fire, carving lines into a piece of driftwood, while the pirates tell stories of other captives, some who paid, some who didn't live to pay. He smiles politely, nods at the right moments, but inside his thoughts are already beyond this island. He knows the exact moment his freedom will be bought, and he knows what will happen after. By now, the pirates like him. Some might even think they're friends, but they've mistaken courtesy for affection. One night, just a few days before the ransom arrives, Caesar stays up later than usual. The others drift away to sleep. The waves slap gently against the shore, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks on the mainland. He looks at the nearest ship, the one he'll take first, and he lets himself imagine it. The sudden attack, the shock in their faces, the crack of wood as the oars bite the sea in the opposite direction. It's not impatience, it's precision. Revenge, for Caesar, will not be a flare of anger. It will be a calm, measured act, like a general moving pieces on a board. The ransom will be delivered soon, very soon. And then, well, you'll see. Because this is just the part where the bowstring is being pulled back. The arrow hasn't even flown yet. The silver arrived on the 48th day. It came in the form of small, heavy bags, carried by men with tight expressions and quicker steps. The pirates counted every coin, their eyes flicking between the money and their strange, smiling prisoner. Caesar stood watching them, his arms loosely crossed. When the leader nodded, payment confirmed, they untied the last of the knots on his wrists. The ropes fell away. "You're free to go," the leader said, grinning. "Little king." Caesar gave him that polite, infuriatingly calm smile. "Thank you for your hospitality." They laughed again, just like they'd had when he'd promised to crucify them. And just like before, they thought it was a joke. The moment he stepped onto the boat taking him to the mainland, the sea breeze felt different, sharper, cleaner. But it wasn't freedom Caesar was breathing in. It was the air before a storm. Back in the coastal city of Milete, Caesar wasted no time. He didn't indulge in rest, didn't even change the weathered tunic he had worn among the pirates. He went straight to the authorities. They gave him the same look the pirates had given him, a mix of skepticism and amusement. "They freed you. You're lucky enough. Why stir trouble?" Caesar's voice was cool, but his words carried steel. "I told them I would return. I am a Roman. My word is law to me." When the officials hesitated, he didn't argue further. Instead, he went to the docks. Within days, Caesar had assembled a small fleet, swift triremes with crews loyal to him. They weren't just sailors. Many were seasoned fighters. The sea was calm on the morning they set out. Caesar stood at the prow, eyes fixed on the horizon. The crew rowed in perfect rhythm, the oar blades flashing silver in the sun. Somewhere ahead lay the island he had memorized, the cove, the curve of the shoreline, the exact spot where the pirates liked to beach their ships. Hours later, the lookout gave a sharp cry. There, just as Caesar had pictured, lay the pirate camp. Smoke drifted lazily from their fires. A few men moved between tents. Several ships rocked at anchor, but their crews were nowhere near battle readiness. Caesar's lips curled in the faintest smile. The attack came like a sudden squall. Roman ships glided silently until the last moment, then surged forward with a rush of water. Grappling hooks bit into wood, pirates clambered on board, and in minutes, the pirate forces were crushed. Some tried to flee inland. Caesar sent men after them, cutting off escape routes. By sunset, it was over. The same men who had laughed at him around their campfires now stood bound in the sand. He didn't waste words. The Romans erected wooden crosses along the beach. The tide lapped at the shore as the first of the condemned was lifted up. Caesar, in a gesture of what he considered mercy, ordered their throats cut before the crosses were raised, a quick death before the slow agony. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. To him, it was justice, not only for himself, but for every merchant, every sailor, every family shattered by pirate raids. When the last body hung against the darkening sky, Caesar stood looking at the line of crosses. The gulls wheeled overhead. The air smelled of salt and blood. It was done. You might think that would be the end of the story, the victorious Roman sailing home, his promise fulfilled. But revenge has a strange aftertaste. That night, aboard his ship, Caesar didn't celebrate. He sat alone, staring into the water. The moon lay a silver path across the waves, and he thought of how quickly tides turn. One day, he knew he might stand on the other side of such a promise. The thought didn't trouble him, it steadied him. And here's where the thread that began with Olga ties itself to another.
Far away in distance, but close in spirit. Different seas, different lands, yet the same quiet in the mind of someone who has done what they said they would do. Olga had walked away from the ashes of her enemy's city without a backward glance. Caesar sailed away from the black silhouettes of the crosses without turning his head. And in another time, another place, a man with no name and no home would also walk away from the bodies of those who wronged him. His story wouldn't have the frost of the north or the salt of the Mediterranean, but dust, drifting in slow spirals over a road that led nowhere. The Japanese would call him Ronin, masterless samurai. He had once been loyal, bound by honor, but betrayal has a way of sharpening the blade in a man's soul. And like Olga, like Caesar, he would learn that the road to vengeance is both long and strangely quiet.
The cicadas were loud that summer. They sang in the trees above the dusty road, their shrill voices cutting through the heavy, humid air. Beneath them, a man walked alone, his straw hat tilted low to shade his eyes. His left hand rested lightly on the hilt of the katana at his side. The right swung free, the fingers tapping against his thigh in slow rhythm with his steps. He had been walking for 3 days. He had counted each sunrise not by the light, but by the sound of the world waking up. Birds, wind, the faint crackle of village fires in the distance. The villagers didn't know his name. They only saw a lone swordsman pass through, a Ronin, masterless, a man whose purpose was his own, whose past was stitched together with silence. There had been a master once. The Ronin didn't speak of him, but the memory was there in every stroke of the sword. He had served with loyalty, the kind of loyalty that bends the self into a weapon for another's cause. For years, he had believed in that cause, believed in the honor that held the clan together, until the betrayal. It came without warning, a whisper in the night, a summons to the inner hall, the smell of incense masking the rot of deceit. His master had traded loyalty for coin, land, and alliances, and in that trade, the Ronin's life had been marked for disposal. He survived because instinct is faster than treachery. A blade drawn in the half-light, a cut through the veil of lies, and then running, through gardens, across rooftops, into the dark. When dawn came, his master's household called him traitor. The truth didn't matter. The truth rarely does when the victors hold the ink and the paper. Now the Ronin lived by the edge of his sword and the weight of his own word. And his word had been given. Somewhere to the east was the man who had carried out the betrayal. Not the master, he was dead now, his end brought by other hands, but the one who had whispered into his master's ear, the one who had placed the blade in the Ronin's back. That man had risen high, now a retainer in the court of a powerful warlord. He would be surrounded by guards, hidden behind the polite walls of etiquette and ceremony. But walls mean nothing to someone who has already been inside them once before. The Ronin reached a crossroads just before sunset. A small inn sat beside the road, its paper lantern swaying gently in the breeze, the smell of cooking rice drifting out into the warm evening. Inside, travelers spoke in low voices, their faces lit by flickering oil lamps. He took a seat in the corner, ordered tea, and listened. It didn't take long. Merchants spoke more freely than soldiers, and tonight they spoke of a feast in the east, the warlord's birthday, a gathering of all his retainers and allies, a time of drink and song and lowered guard. He sipped his tea. The steam curled upward, fading into the shadows above. He knew where he would be in 7 days. The journey eastward was not rushed.
He moved through forests where bamboo stalks clattered softly in the wind. He crossed rivers on narrow bridges, the boards creaking beneath his feet. He passed through towns where children paused in their play to watch the stranger with the sword. At night, he stayed in cheap inns or under the open sky, his blade laid beside him. Sleep was shallow. Dreams were sharp-edged and full of voices from the past. On the 5th day, as he camped beneath a cedar tree, he drew his sword and began to practice. The moon was bright enough to turn the steel silver. Each movement was deliberate, the same drills he had learned as a boy under the eye of a master he once revered. But tonight the drills weren't about discipline. They were about memory, and memory was about justice. 2 days later, the gates of the warlord's estate came into view. Paper lanterns lined the long path to the entrance. Music drifted from inside, flutes, drums, the low thrum of a shamisen. The air smelled of roasted fish and sweet rice wine. Servants bustled about, bowing as richly dressed guests arrived. The Ronin didn't walk up the path. Instead, he moved along the shadows at the edge of the estate, finding a section of wall where the guards were scarce. He waited until the moment was right, a burst of laughter from inside masking the sound of his landing. Within minutes, he was inside the gardens where the moonlight fell on perfectly raked gravel and carefully pruned pines. The sounds of the feast grew louder. He followed them, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Somewhere in there was the man he had come for. The day finally came. A pale morning mist clung low over the Seto inland sea, softening the edges of the world. The air smelled faintly of salt and pine, and the water lapped lazily against the side of the boat that would take Miyamoto Musashi to Ganryujima, the island where he and Sasaki Kojiro would decide, in the eyes of Japan, who was the greatest swordsman alive. But Musashi didn't rush. In fact, he woke late. Some said it was arrogance, others whispered it was strategy. Truth was, he simply didn't like fighting on another man's timetable. Battles, he believed, should happen when he was ready, not when the other man's nerves were still steel and unshaken. He carved his oar into a wooden sword during the journey. It wasn't that he didn't have a real katana. He had many, but Musashi understood something most men didn't. The fight wasn't just about steel meeting steel. It was about control. He was going to walk onto that shore with a weapon Sasaki had never seen before, a weapon that would change the tempo before a single blow was struck. The waves slapped gently against the hull as the boatman rowed. The island drew closer, its rocky beach framed by low, wind-bent pines. He could already see him, Sasaki Kojiro, tall, lean, dressed in a crisp kimono, the famous Monohoshi Zao sword gleaming in the morning light. He was already pacing, already ready. Musashi smiled faintly. Waiting makes men restless. Restlessness makes mistakes. When Musashi finally stepped off the boat, he walked slow, deliberate, the carved oar slung casually over his shoulder. Some onlookers laughed at the sight. Others frowned. Kojiro's eyes narrowed. "You mock me," Kojiro said, drawing his sword in one clean motion. Musashi tilted his head. "I honor you by not wasting steel." And then it began. Kojiro moved like lightning, the tip of his blade cutting the air with a whistle. Musashi sidestepped, his bare feet whispering across the sand. The oar turned boken flashed once in the sunlight. For a moment, the two men were shadows dancing on water. Musashi saw the rhythm, the way Kojiro always favored his right foot, the slight twist in his wrist before a strike. And then, as Kojiro lunged, Musashi stepped inside the arc, and his wooden blade cracked down on Kojiro's skull with a sound that echoed off the cliffs. Silence. Kojiro dropped to his knees, his sword slipping into the sand. Musashi's breath came slow, steady. No cheers, no gloating, just the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees. He had won. The greatest swordsman in Japan was dead at his feet. But victory tasted different now. As he turned away, stepping back into the boat, Musashi realized something unsettling. This duel hadn't been about honor anymore. Not for him. It had been revenge, quiet, calculated, and complete, for the insult Sasaki had given him years before. And now, the need that had driven him for so long was gone. The boat slid away from shore, the island shrinking behind him. He watched the ripples fade in the water, thinking of the countless duels before this one, the men who had fallen, the friends he'd lost along the way. And for the first time in years, Musashi wondered what came next. That night, he stayed in a small inn on the mainland. The old woman who owned it asked him where he had been. "Just across the water," he said softly. She looked at him for a long time. "You've got the look of a man who's finished something important and lost something too." Musashi didn't answer. Outside, the wind was rising, rattling the wooden shutters. He left before dawn, taking only his sword and a small pack.
The road ahead was long, and though his hands still remembered the feel of battle, his heart was searching for something else. Maybe peace, maybe another purpose. And somewhere, far from the shores of Ganryu-jima, another story of revenge was brewing. One that had nothing to do with swords, but with ink, paper, and the quiet power of words. It was the kind of revenge that didn't leave blood on the sand, but scars in the minds of those who read the words. But that is another tale.
You ever hear of someone whose art was so beautiful it could almost make you forget it was born from heartbreak? That's how I think of Artemisia Gentileschi. Now, most people know her name these days as one of the greatest painters of the Baroque period, someone who could swirl light and shadow on canvas like a sorcerer conjuring storms. But in her own lifetime, the streets of Rome didn't speak her name with admiration. They whispered it with scandal. She was 17 when her world cracked. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was a respected painter himself, and he'd taught her the craft from when she could barely hold a brush. She had a gift. By her teens, she was painting pieces so full of life and motion, they could have been breathing. But Orazio wanted her to refine her skills under the mentorship of one of his colleagues, Agostino Tassi. He was charming in that oily, dangerous way. A man who could flatter the air out of a room. He taught her, yes, but he also took something that could never be given back. One day in 1611, while they were alone in the studio, he forced himself on her. And here's where the fire began. You see, in 17th century Rome, a woman's honor wasn't just hers, it was a family's currency. If it was damaged, the family's name was tainted. But Artemisia wasn't just going to hide. Her father, furious and wounded himself, took the matter to court. Now, this wasn't like the courts we think of today. Back then, women accusing powerful men faced humiliation as a matter of course. Artemisia endured public questioning, character assassination, and this is almost unthinkable now. Physical torture in the form of thumbscrews to test the truth of her words. Imagine it, the court tightening cords around her fingers, her bloodline as a painter, just to see if she'd keep to her story. And she did. Every word. Tassi was found guilty and served a grand total of 8 months in prison. That was the justice she got. For most people, that would have been the end. Bitterness curling up like an old vine, choking out whatever light was left. But Artemisia wasn't most people. She left Rome and she left that old life behind, but she carried the wound with her. And here's the thing. She didn't get her revenge in a duel or with a dagger or by shaming Tassi in the streets. She did it with oil paint and canvas. Her work took on a new force, a rage simmering under the skin of every brushstroke. In Florence, she painted Judith slaying Holofernes, a biblical scene where Judith, calm and determined, saws through the neck of the enemy general. Most artists painted Judith with a bit of distance, maybe a clean slice of the sword. Not Artemisia. Her Judith strains with the effort, blood gushes. It's raw, visceral. And if you look closely, really closely, the face of Holofernes looks suspiciously like Agostino Tassi. Now you can call that coincidence if you like. I don't. The more I think about it, the more I realize Artemisia's revenge wasn't just personal, it was public. Every time someone admired that painting, every time they felt the ferocity of Judith's act, they were seeing Artemisia's rage immortalized. She couldn't put Tassi back in court, but she could hang him in 1,000 galleries for centuries to come. And that's exactly what she did. She became one of the first women accepted into the prestigious Academy delle Arti del Disegno in Florence. She worked for dukes, for the Medici, even for King Charles I of England. And always, in the folds of her work, you could find little sparks of that same fury. She didn't need to speak his name again. Her art was speaking for her, in the quietest, most permanent way possible. It makes you think, doesn't it? Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone outright. Sometimes it's about living so well, so fiercely, that their shadow never touches you again. But Artemisia's story, for all its triumph, isn't the last time art and revenge have danced together. In fact, I came across another tale while reading about her. One that's set not in the sunlit studios of Florence, but in the dim, smoky back rooms of Vienna, where another artist plotted his own masterpiece of retribution. And unlike Artemisia, his canvas wasn't just paint, it was music.
Vienna in winter was a city dressed in frost and candlelight. The streets shimmered under a thin layer of snow, horse hooves clicking like a metronome on the cobblestones, and the air carried the faint mingling scents of roasted chestnuts and chimney smoke. Behind the heavy doors of gilded salons, music spilled into the night. Minuets, arias, quartets, the lifeblood of the city's upper circles. In this world, reputation wasn't merely a matter of skill, it was a currency. The right applause at the right performance could lift you into favor with dukes and duchesses. One whispered criticism from the wrong patron could close every door you'd ever knock on. It was into this precise, perfumed battlefield that Lucas Weiss had been born. Lucas was a violinist of startling precision. His bow moved like it was slicing through silk, every note deliberate and cut to the bone. He had been playing since his hands were small enough to barely wrap around the neck of his instrument, driven by a father who believed music was a calling only answered through discipline. By the time he was 25, he had carved himself a place among Vienna's most promising performers, often invited to play before the nobility. But promise was dangerous in Vienna. It drew eyes and enemies. One such enemy was Anton Rademacher. Anton was everything Lucas was not. Charming where Lucas was reserved, flamboyant where Lucas was precise. He could play brilliantly, but he also knew how to be seen playing brilliantly. At salons, he lingered at the wine table, laughing loudly, flattering patrons, planting seeds of his own greatness in every ear. His music was like a rich dessert, sweet, indulgent, leaving listeners lightheaded. For a time, the two men orbited one another without collision. Vienna was large enough to hold two bright stars, or so it seemed. But then came the commission, an invitation from Princess Amalie von Rittberg for a new composition to be debuted at her winter masquerade. The princess was known for her influence. A successful performance in her halls could secure years of work. Both Lucas and Anton were asked to submit pieces.
only one would be chosen. Lucas locked himself away for days, refusing invitations, turning down smaller performances. He wrote in a fever, his candle burning so low the wax pooled dangerously near the paper. Every note he penned was deliberate, threaded with a kind of restrained intensity. It was not a piece that begged for attention. It demanded it. Anton, meanwhile, made sure to be seen everywhere. He played at dinners, flirted with duchesses, sent subtle reminders of his charm to the princess's attendants. His music was like a rich dessert, sweet, indulgent, leaving listeners lightheaded. For a time, the two men orbited one another without collision. Vienna was large enough to hold two great stars, or so it seemed. But then came the commission, an invitation from Princess Amalie von Rittberg for a new composition to be debuted at her winter masquerade. The princess was known for her influence. A successful performance in her halls could secure years of work. Both Lucas and Anton were asked to submit pieces. Only one would be chosen. Lucas locked himself away for days, refusing invitations, turning down smaller performances. He wrote in a fever, his candle burning so low the wax pooled dangerously near the paper. Every note he penned was deliberate, threaded with a kind of restrained intensity. It was not a piece that begged for attention. It demanded it. Anton, meanwhile, made sure to be seen everywhere. He played at dinners, flirted with duchesses, sent subtle reminders of his charm to the princess's attendants. His music, when it came, was lush and theatrical, designed to make the room sigh in pleasure. In the end, the princess chose Anton. The official word was that his piece better suited the joy of the occasion. But the whispers told another story, that Lucas's work had been too severe, that he lacked the warmth to carry a room, that perhaps he should focus on performance rather than composition. Lucas accepted the decision with a smile that barely masked the tightening in his jaw. He attended the masquerade as a guest, standing in the gilded gallery as Anton took the stage in a feathered mask, bowing deeply before launching into his piece. The room swayed with the music. Faces turned toward him as though toward the sun. But Lucas heard something else. Beneath the charm, the crescendos, the easy elegance, he heard theft. A theme. 6 measures, barely noticeable unless you knew where to listen. 6 measures Lucas had played once, months earlier, in a private rehearsal for a small audience of musicians. It had been a fleeting improvisation, never written down. He remembered Anton leaning against the wall that night, smiling faintly as Lucas played. Now, here it was, dressed differently, hidden inside Anton's work, but his nonetheless. That was the moment Lucas's revenge began. He did not rush it. In Vienna, rushing was for the desperate. Revenge, like a well-aged wine, required time. He continued to play at smaller salons, performing with polite precision, avoiding Anton whenever possible. But behind the scenes, he began to compose again. Not just a piece, a trap. The work started innocently enough. A series of duets for violin and piano, something light, fashionable, perfect for gatherings. But woven into them was a slow, unmistakable transformation. Themes shifted from playful to sharp. Harmonies tightened until they felt almost claustrophobic. And in the center of it, those same 6 measures Anton had stolen, but inverted, stretched, sharpened into something unmistakable. Anyone who knew music would recognize the reference. Anyone with ears would feel the change in tone, the shift from invitation to accusation. The piece would require 2 performers, one to play the violin, Lucas himself, and the other to play the piano. The second part, however, was written to be deliberately treacherous. Certain passages demanded impossible precision, subtle tempo shifts designed to trip up even the most skilled pianist unless they had rehearsed under Lucas's exact direction. He had only one person in mind for that second role, Anton. It would take months to maneuver him into it. Lucas knew Anton would never accept if the offer came directly. Instead, he let the idea drift through Vienna salons. A duet for the upcoming spring gala, commissioned by a wealthy merchant who adored both musicians. The merchant, predictably flattered, was eager to fund it. Anton, sensing another chance to bask in an audience's admiration, agreed without hesitation. By the night arrived, the city was buzzing. The program listed only Duet in D minor, composed by Lucas Weiss. The performance began as expected, light, bright, charming. The audience leaned back, sipping wine, enjoying themselves. Anton was radiant at the piano, smiling at the crowd between phrases. Lucas played with measured grace, his bow dancing effortlessly. And then the shift. The key turned darker. The tempo slowed, then quickened in unpredictable bursts. Anton's smile faltered as he began to stumble over the treacherous passages. Lucas, standing tall beside him, never missed a note. The 6 stolen measures appeared, first quietly, almost buried, then louder, sharper, undeniable. Heads in the audience began to turn. A few patrons exchanged glances. They knew. By the time the final note hung in the air, the room was silent. Not the silence of polite applause pending, but the silence of something having been seen. Lucas bowed. Anton did not. That night didn't ruin Anton outright. Vienna was too polite for public execution of reputations. But the invitations grew fewer. The patrons who once greeted him warmly now smiled with a touch of coolness. Musicians whispered about the duet whenever he entered the room. Lucas never mentioned it again. He didn't need to. Because in Vienna, the sharpest blade was not forged of steel. It was drawn of horsehair, pulled across 4 strings.
There's something cruel about applause. Oh sure, to the audience, it's joy, appreciation, release. But when you're on the receiving end, especially in Vienna in 1825, every clap feels like a coin being dropped into a jar of judgment. Is it polite clapping or the wild kind, the thunder that shakes the chandeliers? The difference can make or break a man's soul. For months, our composer, yes, our man, the one we've been following like a shadow, had been rehearsing not just a symphony, but a quiet act of war. His rival, that smug darling of the salons, had stolen an idea months ago, lifted a melody straight from one of our man's sketches, and woven it into his own work. Worse, he'd done it so well that society believed the melody had always been his. And in Vienna, reputation is everything. So revenge here couldn't be loud, at least not in the beginning. Loud revenge in Vienna gets you blacklisted from every salon, every patron's purse. No, it had to be delicate, surgical. A note placed here, a chord altered there. Something that would make the rival's world unravel from the inside out. The plan was set in motion during the rehearsals for the winter concert. Our man offered to conduct his rival's newest piece. A gracious, almost humble offer, the kind people write about in gossip columns as a sign of forgiveness. The rival accepted, smug as ever, thinking himself magnanimous. What the rival didn't realize was that our man had been quietly adjusting. Not the entire piece, no, that would be too obvious. Just enough changes to make the harmonies uneasy, the pacing slightly off, so that when it debuted, it would feel hollow and uninspired, like wine left open too long. The night came. Snow powdered the streets, carriage wheels hissed over slush, and the great hall glowed like a jewel in the cold. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and whispers. Our man stood before the orchestra, bow in hand, and for just a second let his gaze wander to the balcony where the rival sat, smiling. The first note swelled. To most ears, it was beautiful.
But music lovers, the real ones, started frowning, tilting their heads. Something was wrong. The melody was there, but it didn't lift, didn't soar. The violins fought for air. The cellos dragged like heavy boots in snow. By the third movement, the rival's smile was gone. And here's where our man's revenge took a delicious turn. He didn't destroy the piece outright. He made it forgettable. The kind of music that earns polite applause and then vanishes from memory, leaving no trace in history books. A silent erasure, more final than scandal. When it ended, there was applause, yes, but not that chandelier-shaking kind, just that polite coin-drop clatter. Our man bowed once, then twice, the way you do when you're playing a part. The rival clapped too, stiffly, his hands barely kneading. It should have been enough, but revenge rarely feels finished, does it? A few weeks later, our man debuted his own new symphony. And, oh, this was the sweet part, it contained the same stolen melody, but reimagined so brilliantly that it outshined anything the rival had ever done. People left the hall humming his version. And the rival? Well, history has a cruel way of forgetting second place. But here's the thing. Revenge stories have ripples. One evening, months later, after the rival had retreated from Vienna's public life, our man was walking home through narrow streets when he heard a faint melody drifting from a small tavern. Not his melody, but one he recognized from long ago, from before Vienna, before all this. It was an old folk tune, played slowly on a worn violin, and in that moment, he was a child again, sitting by a fire, listening to his grandmother hum the same tune. Funny, isn't it, how one sound can pull you completely out of the present, away from all your victories and grudges. And that memory would be the thread that ties us into our next story. Because that old tune, it wasn't just a song. It was a fragment of something older, something carried across oceans and deserts by people who had their own long, quiet revenges to settle. But that is a tale for another time.
The violinist in the tavern played as if no one was listening. The notes were soft, almost apologetic, curling into the dim air like smoke from a candle wick. The bow barely seemed to touch the strings, yet the sound spread into every corner of the room. Our Viennese composer stood in the doorway, breath catching against the winter chill, listening. The snow on his coat melted into dark patches as he remained still. The melody was one he had not heard in decades, a lullaby his grandmother had hummed when she thought no one was paying attention. A tune older than his family name, older than the Austrian hills. He stepped inside. The tavern smelled of wine, damp wood, and roasted chestnuts. Near the bar, a handful of sailors argued in low, growling tones. A woman with a tired smile poured beer into mugs, her movements weary but precise. But in the farthest corner, the violinist played on, eyes closed, expression caught somewhere between peace and sorrow. The bow danced lightly, and every stroke seemed to reach from somewhere far away, from deserts, from markets, from places the composer had never seen, but suddenly felt he knew. When the song ended, he approached. "Where did you learn that?" The violinist looked up, startled, as if pulled from a dream. "My grandfather taught me," he said slowly. He said his people carried it across the sands, from the great desert to the sea. The composer left a coin on the table and walked out into the cold, but the melody followed him like a shadow. Tafilot, a century earlier. Half a world away, a century earlier, the same tune drifted between the cracked stones of a desert fortress. The wind lifted it and carried it through narrow alleys where children kicked dust into the air and women hoggled over baskets of dates. The city of Tafilat was an oasis, a green wound in the endless gold of the Sahara. At its heart lived Idris al-Khattan, a jeweler whose work was sought from Marrakesh to Cairo. He could carve a silver clasp so fine it resembled frost, set a gemstone so precisely it caught light like captured water. But Idris had not always been a jeweler. 10 years earlier, he'd been a soldier in the emir's guard, proud, loyal, hopelessly young. Until one night, when the emir's younger brother accused him of theft. A lie, but in a court where rank decided truth, it did not matter. The punishment was swift. Exile, confiscation of wages, and a scar down his cheek from his own commander's blade. He vanished into the desert and nearly died before a caravan rescued him. An old Berber craftsman taught him the jeweler's art, his hands softening from sword calluses to silver delicacy. But exile is a coal that never cools. The opportunity for vengeance came with a wedding, the emir's niece to be married in the spring. The court summoned jewelers from across the land to bring gifts for the dowry. Idris was invited. Few remembered his face after a decade in the sands. His gift would not be merely beautiful, it would be a seed. For 3 months he worked in secret. The necklace was silver and deep green malachite, curling like vines. Hidden among the vines was a tear-shaped pendant. Press it, and it released a tiny chime, and that chime played the old desert melody. On the wedding day, Idris entered the palace for the first time since exile. The air was thick with orange blossom. The emir, older now, sat with his younger brother, still carrying the same lazy cruelty in his gaze. Gasps filled the hall when Idris unveiled his gift. The bride's eyes shone. "What is this music?" she asked. "A song of my people," Idris said. "It brings fortune to those who wear it." The emir smiled faintly. The younger brother stared, his brow creasing in recognition. But before he could speak, the court musicians began another song. The crowd's attention shifted, and Idris slipped away. It might have ended there, but the chime was deliberate. The melody, unknown in the palace, began to seep into daily life. Servants hummed it. Guards whistled it unconsciously. The princess sang it at a public gathering. The caravan folk heard it as a signal. Trade routes shifted. Taxes eased for certain traders. Desert clans gained quiet influence in the palace. Idris never returned. His revenge was already woven into the halls like smoke into silk. The younger brother lost his command within a year, not by scandal, but something worse: irrelevance. The song outlived him, crossing seas and centuries until it reached a violin in a tavern in Vienna. On the frozen Volga. The winter was the kind that made even the boldest men hesitate before stepping outside. The Volga lay frozen, a rippling sheet of pale blue and bone white. Yelena stood at its edge, wrapped in a fur cloak heavy enough to swallow her whole. Frost clung to her scarf with each breath. Her eyes were fixed on a crooked fishing hut out on the ice, its chimney coughing a thin thread of smoke. Inside was Pavel Chernov, the last man alive who'd had a hand in killing her brother. It had been 2 years since that night, in the forest. 2 years since the men dragged her brother from the sleigh, beating him until the snow ran red, while she hid in a ditch, biting her hand to keep silent. She had found the others one by one, never quickly, never mercifully. Pavel, the clever one, had always slipped away, until now. She crossed the ice slowly, each step crackling. The wind clawed at her hood. The hut came closer, warped wood, paint flaking. The smell of boiled fish drifted out.
Inside, Pavel hunched over a stove, hands spread towards the heat. He'd aged, hair streaked with gray, cheeks hollow, but his eyes were the same. He didn't recognize her at first. Why would he? The last time he'd seen her, she'd been a shadow in the snow. But when she stepped inside and shut the door, his head snapped up. "You..." She lifted her brother's revolver. "Don't speak." He froze. "You left him to die," she said. "Do you even remember his name?" Silence. She motioned him towards the door. He obeyed, shoulders hunched. They stepped on the ice. "This is where you die," she said. "You won't do it," he said, testing her. She fired at the ice near his feet. The crack spread, water seeping up. She fired again. The slabs tilted. She said, "You'll have a few minutes, long enough to think about him, and about me." She turned away. Behind her came the moan of the ice, the splash, the gasp, then silence. That night in her cabin, she pulled out a folded scrap of paper. On it was the next name. She had heard whispers of others like her, people in far-off lands carrying their own embers of vengeance. Sometimes those embers found each other. A knock came at the door. A man stood there, his coat worn, beard frosted. His eyes burned with something she recognized. "I think," he said quietly, "we have something in common."
So, now in all these stories, which one you liked mostly? Tell me in the comments. Also, if you leave a like on this video, I may buy my little sister a gift she wants. So please like the video. And you can also subscribe to our channel. And you will be the part of our every journey. Once again, thanks for all those who watched till here. Until next time.